Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Arise Beautiful podcast. I am your host, Anjanette Kroom. And here at the Arise Beautiful podcast, we talk about these different subject areas. We talk about relationships, spirituality, service, career/school, and of course, self. And so today we have a special guest. We have Katelyn.
Hey.
I'm going to allow her the opportunity to introduce, themselves.
Thank you. My name's Katelyn. I'm from North Carolina, born and raised. I'm a registered art therapist. I'm also a licensed mental health or licensed. It changed from LPC. Can you help me out with the letters? I don't remember all of it.
It's different everywhere. So
yeah.
LPC, LMHC, LMH.
Yeah, so North Carolina changed from LPC to LMHC, and I don't remember what that stands for, but I'm licensed in both North Carolina and Arizona. And in Arizona, I'm a licensed professional counselor.
Great. All right, so let's get into it. So I asked them to be on our podcast today because I know her from college. I know them from college, and it's been like an amazing opportunity to like see you grow and like to see like your art turn into like healing spaces for people. So it's been really cool. So let's talk a little bit about your journey and kind of what got you into this work.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So in terms of art therapy, I actually didn't even know what it was until I was in high school. My mom said I always did art. She said when I was 3, as soon as I could pick up a crayon, I was always drawing and making something. And I found out I was interested in psychology when my sister was about 4 years older than me. When she brought her textbooks home from college, I would read them. And so I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And I've always been a book nerd. I've always been a huge geek. So like I would read her college textbooks and sometimes like summarize it to her, like if she had homework. And so my mom showed me this article. For those of you in North Carolina, you're familiar with the News Observer. And it was a local newspaper about these Black Vietnam War vets who were helped with their PTSD through art therapy. And that really resonated with me. I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. So hopped on the computer, Googled it, found a grad program, and this is in high school. Like that's usually people don't stick with the first thing that they want to do. So I went to Meredith College for 4 years, and I double majored in psychology and also studio art. And then I went straight from undergrad to graduate school at the George Washington University in DC. And I have my master's of art in art therapy. After that, the training for art therapy is similar to getting an LPC. So I was able to be a registered art therapist, earn my hours for that at the same time as getting my LPC. It was a lot of paperwork, even though it was the same hours. But I just figured out who I needed to see for supervision, because unfortunately, not every state has a license for creative art therapists. Like there's a handful that do, but for the ones that don't, it's advantageous to have an LPC if they don't have that creative art therapy license.
Wow, like that's amazing, because I always tell people like you got a plan, like right, like how do you leverage your degree to help you meet your goals? Because a lot of times people are like, oh, getting a master's degree or getting a degree is like obsolete now, it doesn't matter. And it's like, well, it does matter if you have a plan for it. Like if you don't have a plan for it, it's like it becomes a piece of paper, and then you have to take extra steps. And it sounds like you've been very clear on like your journey and what you needed to do, as far as like doing the research and making sure you had like a really solid plan to do things like simultaneously as, getting your art certification as well as your LPC.
Yeah, and it would be one thing if I were mainly doing community work with people, but in terms of getting approved for grants, working in healthcare settings, it is important to have that degree and that license with how things are set up, especially with insurance and billing.
Exactly. Making that mental health piece like accessible.
Yeah.
because I would say like, what, like, is there a lot of like art therapists that are out there?
I would say yes and no. And the field of art therapy is really similar to other programs, like when there's a higher degree. Like I know for art therapy graduate students, there's a higher rate of international students than there are students of color who are American, but that's pretty much across the board for most education programs. And then also the demographic is mostly cishet white women. And so there are quite a few, but in terms of like looking for people who look like us or have different experiences outside of the cishet white norm, there's not a lot. Like I think there's about, I would say similar to other professions, like 2% are made up of Black and brown people, or like at least African Americans.
Right. Okay. That's good. Okay, so how has that been in like navigating these spaces as an other in many different categories?
Honestly, because of one of the training experiences I had, it was probably one of the last training experiences I had in person before everything shut down with COVID. Like I said, it was like March 2020.
Mm.
Um, it was like probably around, I want to say like 30 or 40 people. Most of them were cishet white women. And it was through, I don't want to share too much because I don't want to necessarily. I mean, I've left public reviews. I don't necessarily like want to put anyone on blast on your podcast, but it was a training program for mental health, like a specific modality. Me and another colleague who happened to be a friend who I grew up with in North Carolina were the only two Black people there. Um, I believe it was just me and one other person who was trans or non-binary. And so like we were constantly misgendered by people, like people not even making an effort or saying like, oh, it was too hard. Or when me and my colleague like brought up issues of racism and like how that intersected with the modality they were teaching, the facilitator was like, oh, this is so depressing. Let's talk about something else, and
Mm.
dismissing it and other things. And so after that, there's been some other trainings I've been to that have been okay. I was like, I'm going to be really conscious to see if I can find any type of trainings that's more like indigenous and spiritual practices, or trainings that are led by other people of color, trainings led by Black women, like looking for what feels like a safe place for me to foster my career and my professional identity, because I can't anymore. Like I like even with speaking things, like I'm very intentional about who I'm speaking with and who's in the room and who's going to be in the audience. Because if it's another case of, even if I'm the speaker, but it's mostly cishet white people in the room, that I can't do that anymore. It's just too much.
It can be very draining. Very
Yeah.
draining.
And there are Black people who sign up to train white people and like how to be aware, like work on like just dismantling the systemic racism and like doing their part. I'm not one of those people. So I'm recognizing my boundaries of like, okay, these are the spaces that I need to be occupying.
Yeah, definitely. I've had similar experiences in trainings. I think I did like a really, I want to say it was probably like a 30-hour like trauma training. And I'm so glad that like I didn't do it by myself. Like we showed up as an agency, and so the agency
Okay.
that I work with is it's multicultural wellness. So all of our clinicians are clinicians of color. And I just remember having like our breakout rooms, and we were discussing the topic matter, and we always brought it to the group like, yeah, nah, this is not, but then it became, oh,
Yeah.
tell us more, teach us more. And we're like, but you're supposed to be training us.
Yeah. And there's people who have those jobs who are like diversity inclusion consultants
Yeah.
who will do that job. But no, I'm here to be trained. I'm paying you for training, but then you want me to do another job and your emotional labor. Like that's not for us.
Yes, yes, yes. So I love it. Okay, so what has worked for you as far as creating this space for yourself?
So right now, I would say the past year and a half, I work as a contractor as a therapist. I'm a 1099, and that's given me a lot of freedom where I can really be intentional about like the communities that I'm working with, populations that I'm working with, um, trying to figure out ways that I can be accessible to different communities I'm a part of as well. So I contract at a private practice, and I also talk with the manager, and she's okay with me receiving grant funds for some of my clients.
Mhm.
So some of the clients I see are funded through grants through that as well as private pay. And also, I still do contract work with the LGBTQ Center in Durham,
Mhm.
and that work is grant funded as well. So it feels really good to be able to do work where people can access therapy either for free or low cost if the grant doesn't cover the entire fee of the session, because it's not accessible to everybody. Even with insurance, it can get really expensive.
Okay. So what population do you work with?
I primarily work with Black and Brown queer people. I would probably say 3/4 of my clients are either trans or gender nonconforming, and all of my clients are LGBTQ. And I would say 90% of my clients are Black and Brown people.
Great. That's amazing. Because you're like a unicorn, right?
That's what I get a lot from
Yeah.
people. They'll be like, I typed in a search and you popped up. I'm like, really? Or like parents will be like, oh my gosh, it took forever to find you.
Yeah. Yeah. Just and I love that. One of the things at Arise Beautiful that I always like to say is what's really important is showing up as yourself, like as your best self, whatever that is. And who you are kind of makes space for yourself in this world. And it seems like you're doing a pretty good job of like being you, showing up exactly how you are, and pursuing your interests and creating a space for you, which also creates community for someone else.
Yeah. And I've been really fortunate, the opportunities I've been able to find and really blessed. Because there have been jobs where I started showing up as me, and then like other people had an issue or having to deal, like I worked for a state hospital in North Carolina for a few years, and it got to a point I couldn't do it anymore. The policies that were in place were really good for patients, even though like quite a few of the staff would either be transphobic or homophobic or racist. It
Mhm.
didn't matter because there was patient advocates, like me and other coworkers, like we reported the hospital if we saw something. It would like have people interviewed until something got changed and like rectified for patients. But then there was nothing, it seemed like HR couldn't really do anything like if someone did something towards me. Like there was an instance where I was in the office charting, and a nurse looked dead at me and dead named a patient who was trans, like waiting for me to have a reaction. I just looked, I just need to do my job and clock out. So I just kept doing my work, but it was like little things like that kept adding up. Or if someone like wasn't transphobic towards me, like they were either doing or like perpetuating racism, I just couldn't do it anymore. So I went from working in inpatient hospitals to working at a private practice.
Okay. Yeah, I have a lot of discussions with other like clinicians of color too, and that seems to be like a common thing where like it's fine as far as like the clients have the support and stuff that they need to report incidents. There's, you have your whole system worked out, but when it comes to you as an employee, when you're dealing with these microaggressions, it's really hard to like report it and find the support there, because then people are like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, brush it off, and that kind of stuff. I had a friend tell me,
Yeah.
she's a social worker, and she was telling me about how like her boss literally like was in her hair, like, playing with her locks in the meeting in front of everybody. Like,
Yeah. I had a coworker at that same job that I mentioned, like her supervisor would try to like pet her on the head, and they'd be like, oh, my son-in-law is it's a mess.
yes, yes, yes. And so like, how did you know that it was time to like move on and kind of honor yourself?
I would say the work I was doing with my therapist, and then also seeing how other people were responding to things that were happening at that job. And it just got to the point I was like, I just could not anymore. And so I just started aggressively job searching. I had considered opening my own private practice. And this, I think it's a lot easier now because of the pandemic, because there's a lot of laws that have changed that have enabled telehealth. So you could start your own practice without overhead.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the time, it just seemed like I couldn't figure out like how to make things work, which people like you can get a business loan, you can build capital. It just there was a lot going on like for me personally, and
Mm-hmm.
also still having like I couldn't just have time where I just resigned from that job until I figured something out. So it just seemed easier to be a W-2 out of private practice
Right.
right after that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then too, like, the population that you serve, like, access and the financials and stuff, it doesn't, you're not going to be charging your clients,
Yeah.
$300 for a session, like that's not sustainable for them. And so, that's one big thing, like you mentioned before, making your resources accessible to other people. Um, okay, so in your journey, kind of what was the biggest lesson that you say you learned through it all?
I would say the biggest lesson I've had is being able to see myself the way my loved ones have seen me. Because there was a lot of times where I just didn't trust myself or didn't trust the process. And it wasn't just me. Like I have like my parents are very supportive. My sister's really supportive. I have a lot of good friends and other like extended families like backing me up. Like it wasn't just me. I have a community,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the biggest lesson is like just being able to trust myself and trust the process like of things falling into place. Because a lot of times I'm like even like recently I'll be like people come to me for therapy, like that's wild.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
just kind of shifting my focus of like okay, like I do have a lot of experience and I have had times where I've been able to learn what I need to learn to be in the place that I am now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, this is the topic we're talking about, education and career. And so how would you say your education played into your process of getting to where you are?
hmm I think this one has a couple of layers to it for me. So
Mm-hmm.
I do see a lot of merit and a lot of like found like decent foundational principles in the education that I've learned from undergrad and grad school. That being said, there were a lot of things I had to go out of my way to learn because the way and I went to predominantly white schools. So I had to go out of my way to figure out like, okay, this is a Eurocentric viewpoint or this is a white American viewpoint. Like, what are the other viewpoints out there? Like when it came to cultural competency in grad school, I think maybe it was like a paragraph for a different culture or demographic. There was one class I had that I appreciated. Like we had to pick a community and like really immerse ourselves with that community. So I did participate in a few things in a culture that I didn't know a lot about and found out that there's similarities. Like for example, there was a rabbi that I got a chance to interview, and I went to a few community things that involve like dancing and just learning different things about the Jewish culture. But the rabbi was telling me like there, I can't remember if there's like a name to it, but she was just explaining like they're rarely on time for things. I was like, oh, that sounds like CP time.
Right.
And so like it's always cool like to find those similarities with cultures. Um, so I did appreciate that class in grad school, like that had us go out of our way to learn something, but with a lot of the other classes it'll be like this group of people might blah 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 or this like it might have been like one sentence or one paragraph. So I think as far as figuring out like what would work for me and what would work for the populations I'm working with, getting that. But when it comes to other things, like a lot of things that I learned are obsolete now. I think some clinicians are still operating in this way, but being taught that autism and being taught that ADHD is this very gendered thing and it's mostly boys that have it. I was diagnosed with autism last October, and like I don't fit any of the mold of like what they say like this is what exactly what autism looks like. And I remember being taught in undergrad, like autistic people are mostly white, or mostly like white middle class boys or something like that. It was
Mhm.
just like something random that sounded odd. I was like, that sounds odd, but
Like, where you get that from?
yeah. And so I think figuring out like, okay, like this is the basis, this is what would work for me, this is what would work for the people I'm working with, and then like what are some of those other practices and ways of being that can also help for healing too. And I also tell my clients, I'm like, have you considered like some spiritual practice, have you considered acupuncture, like just letting them know like therapy's not the end all be all, but just figuring out like what would help you for your healing.
Mhm. I like that approach. I have a similar experience too. Like you get your formal education, you get your piece of paper so you can check the boxes, so you get your license.
Yeah.
But then like when you're in actual practice and you start to see these things show up, especially, you know, people of color, when they sit down in a therapy seat, like they have different expectations. Um,
Yeah.
like we're not going to sit here and like hash through my past and like trauma like all day. Like they want resolution, they want solutions, they want something. And so I'm finding that too. And at first I thought, oh, it was confusing to me. I think it caught me off guard. Like I'm
Hmm.
not prepared for this kind of like, wait, what happened? Naturally I love information. So naturally I'm gonna like go to all the trainings, like all the trainings. But I think I had I went to one training. I think it was like the inaugural like Black Play Therapy Symposium like training. And it was my first time seeing a conference specifically designed for clinicians of color. The way we had like the breakout sessions, like the trainings, everything was done through the lens of serving us. And one, like the wow, this exists, right?
Yeah, that sounds really refreshing.
I was like, wow, this exists. And then two, like there were so many successful like clinicians that have built successful like private practices and like, we're just doing the things in mental health. And I was so shocked by that because that was something that I never seen before. I just didn't have I knew I wanted to go into private practice, but I never thought outside of like the one-to-one therapy and like getting in there. But all these different cool modalities, all these different ways of healing, and just simply connecting with all these other people and being able to be like, oh, you're having problems in this area. Well, I know someone that could, do that and know that like they're there. So, having
Yeah.
of color that are sex therapists and clinicians of color that are play therapists and, all of these really unique niches that you don't really see us in. So yeah, I do agree with you with like the actual practice of applying what we learned in school. It's some bumpy roads.
Yeah. And I will say this, like it can be really hard sometimes, like staying true to yourself and being your genuine self in a lot of cases, especially if you're feeling like, oh, am I gonna lose this job opportunity or this career connection? But when you are yourself, how you said earlier, building community for clients, like people have reached out to me because of my identities and just putting myself out there of what my values are or just who I am as a person. And so just from me putting specific and personal things in my bio, there was a nonprofit that reached out to me, and I've been working with them and consulting with them, and they primarily work with Black and Brown people in the community. And I wouldn't have gotten that opportunity like if I had some sort of like cookie cutter bio as a therapist.
That's important too. And I think that's the space that I'm in as well. Like really understanding in the mental health field the importance of like having your niche, like like there is a specific group of people that I am called for that I am most effective with, right? So those are the people that I want to have in front of me. And as I'm moving into the private practice space, similar to you, like we have more control over the clients that we can help. And part of that is being us. And I remember in school when they told us like, no, what is that? No, like self-disclosure and like all of
Yeah,
that.
that's a very white, like that's a very cishet patriarchy thing. Like, I'm the expert and I did like what I say goes, but you're not gonna know anything about me. Like, that wouldn't work for me. And the therapist I have now, like, she's really like open and cool, and she's a Black therapist. She's Black and queer too.
Mhm.
And it was very hard, like being in Arizona, it was hard for me to find her. Like, I was on her wait list for about a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, I'm being true to me, I'm finding that I'm a better therapist. I'm, more helpful to clients that are like seeking what I got to offer. And then two, recognizing when a client, when there's a client in front of me that's not a good fit for me, like the struggle, like, ooh, this is, I'm gonna have to refer you somewhere else. This isn't working. But being true to myself, I think that's really important as we are going in our careers, going through our educational experience, always asking the question, like, why are we doing this? Because I still attend like regular trainings. And for me, one of the things that I know I like to do is, okay, I'll go to this training and then I'll filter it through like, how do I make this relevant for who I'm trying to service?
Yeah.
um, and so that's one of the things for me is like, I'm really good with taking, the therapy lingo, flipping it and putting it into language that people can understand and make it relevant. That's all. So I do a lot of trainings. I train other clinicians that work at my agency as well. But
Okay.
and that's what I do. I go to like random like trainings and then I bring it back, filter it, flip it, and then make it relevant so that they can deliver it and have it be effective for the people. So I guess, what would you say um, where would you say that you are right now in like your process of like discovering yourself and how you show up every day?
Oof, this is a heavy one. Um, One of my friends pointed out to me that recently, I believe like April 1st and 2nd of this year, 2022, there was like a spiritual new year. I can't explain all the ins and outs of it because I'm not like that attuned to astrology, but I'm sure y'all can Google and look that up. But she was sharing that with me because April 1st, I happened to have top surgery a few weeks ago this year. And so it just feels like there have been a lot of new beginnings for me. There's also been a lot of struggles recently too, which I'm not surprised by because typically like it's kind of how things ebb and flow for me.
Mhm.
Like, I feel like when I'm just on the precipice of like reaching something greater, something better, it seems like when it rains, it pours. um, but I think because of how things have been lining up for me recently, I've been able to show up more authentically, like in my personal relationships, and also more authentically at work and be present in a different way. And so that's been really nice.
Good, good. I'm glad to hear your process. And like all of us, like it's a struggle every day. We're learning more and more and more about ourselves. Um, and just being brave enough to like lean in and be like, well, this is me. And there may not be anyone else that has this little quirk, and that's okay. Um,
Yeah.
and so, like I said, it's been a pleasure to watch your journey. And so I ask all of my guests, as the last thing that we do is to do the
Okay.
beautiful affirmation. And so I like to say, the arise beautiful is a command. It's a command to self, calling yourself forward. And so to leave the listeners with your arise beautiful affirmation, what would that be?
It would be arise beautiful. Remember, it is okay to be you and that you are enough.
Love it. I love it. It is okay to be you in that you are enough. I love it. Um, because again, that's our number one thing at Arise Beautiful is just being you. There is room for you in this world, and you are made to be different by design. Like, we're not made to be the same. And so to walk in all of that fullness, the entirety of who you are. So thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. It's been a pleasure talking
Yeah, definitely.
in your journey. And so if people want to find you, where can they find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Katelyn Rochelle Art. That is Instagram at KatelynRicheLleArt. And you can also find me on Twitter at Katelyn Rochelle at KatelynRichelle.
All right. Well, thank you again for being a guest. And for everyone who enjoyed this podcast episode, make sure you like, share with your friends, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay tuned for our next episode.